Qatar's Australian Party Senator Fraser Anning makes his maiden speech in the Senate chamber at Parliament House in Canberra, Australia, August 14, 2018. Photo by McTSIEKAS, EPAFA, Rex, Shutterstock by Rick Nowak. August 15 at 8:03 a.m. Email the author. When recently appointed Australian Sen. Fraser Anning commenced his maiden speech on Tuesday. Few had heard of the right-wing Queensland politician. And if you had only watched the end of it, when Australian politicians including the leader of the government in the Senate shook Anning's hand, following a long-standing tradition after a maiden speech, you wouldn't have sensed anything suspicious, either. But in between, Anning had just demanded final solution to Muslim immigration, using Adolf Hitler's exact words to describe what is now known as the Holocaust, in which the Nazis killed 6 million Jews and millions of other people. We should go back to that and ban all immigrants receiving welfare for the first 5 years after they arrive. The final solution to the immigration problem is, of course, a popular vote, Anning said. Now, the member of the fringe Qatar's Australian Party is known across Australia, but for all the wrong reasons. Anning refused to apologise for his remarks, saying that they were not meant to be understood in the Nazi context. But even as his party leadership stood by Anning, the vast majority of Australian politicians viewed his comments as deliberate and despicable. Leaders of all major parties condemned the rhetoric, with Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull describing it as appalling. 2 words would speak for the brutalisation and murder of millions. 2 words that evoke fear and grief and trauma and loss, said Bill Shorten, leader of the Australian Labor Party. The disgust voiced over Anning's remarks might be real, but just as real are some of the other headlines that Australia's Conservative government has itself produced in recent years. Australia abandons refugees to a life of uncertainty and peril. Amnesty International, UN official says Australia responsible for inhuman treatment of asylum seekers. The Guardian, shocking, UN again slams Australia's treatment of refugees. SBS News, UN slams Australia for refugee mistreatment. For the 5th time in 2017, Refugee Council of Australia's refugee policy of cruelty. New York Times, in Parliament, the Australian government's rhetoric has largely remained conciliatory. Prime Minister Turnbull emphasised this week that people from every corner of the earth, from every religion, or of none, and every race can connect, be inspired by, be part of our values. That is Australia. Some of the Turnbull government's actions, however, have sent a very different message. For 5 years, Australia has detained hundreds of refugees on a remote island that is part of Papua New Guinea. Deadly clashes, deteriorating conditions and pro-immigration protests in Australia kept their plight in the public debate. Some of the men have since been resettled in the United States, but human rights organizations recently raised renewed concerns over the health of those who remain. Australia maintains that the criticism is unfair and that Papua New Guinea officials are to be blamed. But abroad, the dispute has made the country's self-perception as a human rights defender less credible. Australia's Refugee Council accused Turnbull's government last year of fast becoming an international pariah in relation to its human rights record, and expressed concerns over the lives and safety of many thousands of people suffering due to Australia's cruel policy and practices. The UN Human Rights Committee's Vice-Chairman, Yuval Shani, lashed out at Australia's chronic non-compliance with human rights laws last year. The question is, how does the state justify treating migrants as criminals, he asked. The UN report issued later urged the Australian government to take more steps to combat racist hate speech and violence. The concern, experts warned, was that anti-immigrant rhetoric may eventually escalate. At the time, the Australian government described the criticism as bizarre.